The starving child at his fence held a golden locket and whispered that it was her dead mother's final gift. When Elijah Tanner opened it and saw his own portrait staring back, he realized the woman he had abandoned 25 years ago had kept his face pressed against her heart until her dying breath. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The child appeared at the edge of Elijah Tanner's property just as the autumn sun began its slow descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley he had called home for nearly 30 years. She was small, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with tangled brown hair that hung past her shoulders and a dress so worn and patched that it seemed held together more by prayers than thread. In her arms, she clutched a bundle wrapped in what might have once been a blanket, and her face bore the unmistakable marks of exhaustion and hunger that Elijah had seen too many times in this unforgiving territory. He had been mending the fence along the southern pasture when he first spotted her, a tiny figure moving slowly but determinedly across the open grassland that separated his ranch from the main road to town. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, the way they sometimes did when he had been working too long under the harsh Wyoming sun. But as she drew closer, he could see that she was real enough, and that she was heading directly toward him with the kind of single-minded purpose that suggested she had been walking for a very long time. Elijah Tanner was not a man accustomed to visitors. At 52, he had earned a reputation in Copper Creek as a solitary figure, a man who kept to himself and preferred the company of his horses and cattle to that of his fellow human beings. The townsfolk respected him for his honesty and his skill with livestock, but they had long since stopped trying to draw him into their social circles. He attended church when the weather allowed, purchased his supplies at the general store with minimal conversation, and returned to the isolation of his ranch as quickly as propriety would permit. It had not always been this way. There had been a time many years ago when Elijah Tanner had been known for his easy smile and his willingness to lend a hand to any neighbor in need. But that was before Sarah, before the fever that had taken her from him in the winter of their 3rd year together, before the emptiness that had settled into his bones and never quite left. After Sarah's death, something in Elijah had closed off, a door that he had firmly shut against the possibility of ever feeling that kind of loss again. The child stumbled as she reached the fence line, catching herself against the wooden rails with hands that trembled from weakness rather than fear. She looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face, hazel eyes that held depths of sorrow and determination that made something in Elijah's chest tighten unexpectedly. Those eyes reminded him of someone, though in that moment he could not quite place who. "Mister," she said, and her voice was hoarse, as if she had not had water in quite some time. "Are you Elijah Tanner?" The question startled him more than her presence had. It was one thing for a lost child to wander onto his property seeking help. It was quite another for her to know his name, to have been looking for him specifically. He set down his hammer and wire, straightening to his full height, and studied her more carefully. Up close, he could see that her face was streaked with the remnants of tears, dried tracks through the dust that coated her cheeks. Her lips were cracked from thirst, and there was a bruise on her arm that looked several days old. "I am," he replied cautiously. "And who might you be, child?" She swayed slightly, and he moved instinctively forward, reaching out to steady her before she could fall. The bundle in her arm shifted, and he realized it contained nothing more than a few pieces of clothing and what appeared to be a small leather pouch. She was traveling light because she had nothing else to carry. "My name is Clara," she said, her small hand gripping his forearm with surprising strength. "Clara Bennett. My mama sent me to find you. She said you were the only one who could help me now." The name Bennett meant nothing to Elijah, and he searched his memory for any recollection of a woman who might have sent this child to his door. Copper Creek was a small community, and in the 30 years he had lived here, he thought he knew most of the families within 100 miles. But Bennett was not a name he recognized, and the mystery of it deepened the unease that had begun to settle in his stomach. "Where is your mother now?" he asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer. Clara's face crumpled, and the tears that had left those tracks on her dusty cheeks began to fall fresh. "She's dead, mister. Died 3 weeks ago from the consumption. Before she went, she made me promise to find you. Said you'd take care of me, that you'd understand once you saw what she left me." The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. A dying woman, someone he could not even remember, had sent her child across who knew how many miles of dangerous territory to find him. It made no sense. He was a stranger to this girl, a name her mother had spoken with her last breaths. But what possible connection could there be between them? "Child, I think there's been some mistake," he said gently, though he made no move to release her arm or send her away. Whatever error had brought her here, she was clearly in need of food, water, and rest. The questions could wait until she was no longer swaying on her feet from exhaustion. "Come inside. We'll get you something to eat and drink, and then you can tell me more about your mother and why she sent you to me." Clara shook her head stubbornly, reaching into the bundle she carried with her free hand. "No, mister. Mama said I had to show you right away. She said once you saw it, you'd understand everything." She pulled out a small object that caught the last rays of the setting sun, a golden locket on a delicate chain that seemed far too fine for a child in her circumstances to possess. It was old. Elijah could see that much, with intricate engravings on its surface that spoke of craftsmanship and care. The kind of thing a woman might treasure above all her other possessions. The kind of thing she might press into her daughter's hands with her dying breath. "This locket was my mother's last gift," Clara whispered, her voice breaking with emotion as she held it out to him. "She wore it every day of my life. Said it held the most precious thing she ever had besides me." Elijah's hand trembled as he reached for the locket, though he could not have said why. There was something about the object that called to him, something familiar in its weight and shape that stirred memories he had thought long buried. His fingers closed around the warm metal, and he felt Clara watching him with an intensity that seemed to stop time itself. "Open it," she said. "Please, mister, open it and see." The catch was stiff from years of use, but it yielded to his calloused fingers after a moment's pressure. The locket swung open in his palm, revealing a small portrait painted with exquisite skill on ivory, and Elijah Tanner felt the world tilt beneath his feet as he stared at his own face looking back at him from across the years. The portrait was unmistakably him, though it showed a younger man than the one who now stood frozen in the fading light of the Wyoming evening. The Elijah in the locket had fewer lines around his eyes, less silver in his dark hair, and there was something in his expression that the present Elijah had not seen in his own reflection for many years. Hope, perhaps, or the particular kind of joy that comes from being young and believing that the future holds nothing but promise. He remembered when this portrait had been painted. It had been in St. Louis nearly 25 years ago, during a brief period when he had worked as a horse trainer for a wealthy merchant family. He had been 27 years old, full of ambition and dreams, saving every penny he could toward the day when he would have enough to buy his own land and build his own life. The portrait had been a gift from someone he had tried very hard to forget, someone whose memory now came flooding back with the force of a river breaking through a dam. "Where did your mother get this?" His voice came out rough, barely recognizable even to his own ears. The child was watching him with those ancient eyes, waiting for the understanding her mother had promised would come. But Elijah was not ready to understand. He was still struggling to breathe around the tightness in his chest, still trying to reconcile the impossible thing he held in his hands with the careful walls he had built around his heart. "She always had it," Clara said simply, "for as long as I can remember. She used to look at it when she thought I was sleeping, and sometimes she would cry. I asked her once who the man in the picture was, and she told me he was someone she had loved very much, someone she had lost before I was born." Lost. The word echoed in Elijah's mind, carrying with it the weight of choices made and paths not taken. He had not been lost. He had left, deliberately and completely, because staying had become impossible once he understood the truth of his situation. But he had never imagined that his leaving would create ripples that would reach across decades to touch his life again. "Your mother," he said slowly, forcing himself to meet the child's eyes. "What was her name?" her full name, before she married. She never married, mister. She was always just Mama to me, but her name was Elizabeth. Elizabeth Ann Whitmore. The name struck him like a bullet to the chest. Elizabeth. Eliza, he had called her, in those stolen moments when they had dared to imagine a future together. She had been the daughter of the merchant family he worked for, beautiful and spirited, and utterly forbidden to someone of his station. He had known from the beginning that nothing good could come of their attachment, but he had been young and foolish and desperately in love, and she had sworn that she loved him too. They had planned to run away together, to escape the rigid social expectations that kept them apart, and build a new life in the West where such things mattered less. But on the night they were supposed to leave, Elijah had overheard a conversation between Elizabeth's father and another man, a conversation that had shattered every dream he had ever dared to dream. "She's been seen with that horse trainer again," the other man had said. "People are beginning to talk. If you don't put a stop to it soon, there will be no salvaging her reputation." And Elizabeth's father had laughed, a cold, dismissive sound that still haunted Elijah's memories. "Let her have her little amusement. She knows perfectly well that nothing can come of it. I have already arranged her marriage to the Henderson boy, and she has agreed to the match. This infatuation with the hired help is merely a final act of rebellion before she settles into her proper place. By this time next year, she will be safely married and will have forgotten all about Elijah Tanner." Elijah had not waited to hear more. He had saddled the fastest horse in the stable and ridden out of St. Louis that very night, leaving behind everything he owned and everyone he had thought he loved. The portrait Elizabeth had commissioned as a gift for him was the one thing he had forgotten to take, and he had assumed she would have destroyed it once she realized he was gone. Instead, she had kept it. For 25 years, she had kept his portrait close to her heart, had wept over it in the darkness when she thought no one could see, had clutched it in her hands as death claimed her, and whispered his name to her daughter as the only hope the child had left. "Mr. Tanner." Clara's voice pulled him back to the present. She was shivering now, whether from cold or exhaustion or both, and the last light was fading rapidly from the sky. "Mr. Tanner, are you all right?" He closed the locket carefully, his fingers lingering on its worn surface as if it might disappear if he let go. The questions burning in his mind would have to wait. Whatever connection existed between him and Elizabeth Whitmore, whatever secrets her daughter carried, the child before him was cold and hungry and alone in the world. That was the immediate problem that needed solving. "Come inside," he said again, and this time it was not a suggestion but a gentle command. "You need food and warmth and rest. Tomorrow, when you have recovered your strength, you can tell me everything. Every word your mother spoke about me, every memory you have of her. But tonight, you need to let someone take care of you." Clara's lower lip trembled, and for a moment she looked like what she truly was, a frightened child who had lost everything and traveled an impossible distance on nothing but faith and a dying woman's promise. "You believe me then? You understand why Mama sent me?" Elijah looked down at the locket in his hand, at the face of a man he barely remembered being, at the evidence of a love he had thought was nothing but a rich girl's game. He did not understand, not yet, but he was beginning to suspect a truth so enormous that it threatened to reshape everything he thought he knew about his own life. "I believe your mother had her reasons," he said carefully, "and I believe she loved you enough to send you to the one person she thought might help. That is enough for now." He placed his hand gently on Clara's thin shoulder and guided her toward the ranch house, its windows dark against the gathering night. Behind them, the first stars were appearing in the vast Wyoming sky, witnesses to a reunion that had been 25 years in the making and was only just beginning to unfold. The ranch house had not seen a child within its walls for as long as Elijah could remember. It was a bachelor's dwelling, functional and sparse, with none of the softening touches that a woman's presence might have brought. The furniture was sturdy but plain, the walls bare of decoration save for a single photograph of Sarah that hung above the fireplace, and the kitchen held only the essentials required to feed one man who cared little for culinary variety. But as Elijah watched Clara devour the simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried beef he had placed before her, he found himself seeing his home through different eyes. The chair she sat in was too large for her small frame, forcing her to perch on its edge to reach the table. The lamp cast shadows that might frighten a child unused to such isolation. The silence that he had come to treasure pressed against the walls like a living thing, broken only by the sounds of her eating and the crackle of the fire he had built to ward off the evening chill. "When did you last have a proper meal?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her with a cup of coffee he did not really want. It gave his hands something to do, while his mind raced through possibilities and implications he was not yet ready to voice. Clara paused in her eating, a flush of embarrassment coloring her pale cheeks. "The Hendersons gave me breakfast yesterday morning. They have a farm about 30 miles east of here. Mrs. Henderson wanted me to stay longer, but I told her I had to keep moving. Mama made me promise not to stop until I found you. 30 miles in a day and a half on foot, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a dead woman's locket to guide her." The thought of what might have happened to her on that journey, alone and vulnerable on the open prairie, made something cold settle in Elijah's stomach. There were dangers in this territory that even grown men approached with caution, and this slip of a girl had walked through them all without hesitation. "How did you know where to find me?" he asked. "Copper Creek is not exactly on any main road, and the Tanner Ranch is not marked on most maps." Clara reached for the leather pouch she had carried in her bundle, the one Elijah had noticed earlier. She opened it with careful fingers and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn soft from handling and covered in handwriting that made Elijah's breath catch in his throat. He would have recognized that elegant script anywhere, even after all these years. Elizabeth had always written as if each letter was a small work of art. "Mama wrote everything down for me," Clara said, sliding the paper across the table toward him. "She said she had been keeping track of you for years, ever since I was born. She hired men to find out where you had gone, what you had done with your life. She knew about your ranch, about the town, about the wife you married and lost. She knew everything, Mr. Tanner, but she never tried to contact you, not until she knew she was dying." Elijah's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter. The paper was dated 3 months ago, and the handwriting, while still beautiful, showed signs of the weakness that must have been claiming Elizabeth's body even then. He forced himself to focus on the words, though each one felt like a stone being added to a weight he was not sure he could bear. "My dearest Elijah," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then Clara has found you, and I am gone from this world. I have so much to tell you, so much to explain, and I fear that no letter could ever contain the full truth of what happened between us. But I will try, because our daughter deserves to know her father, and you deserve to know the child you never knew existed. Our daughter." The words blurred before his eyes, and Elijah had to set the letter down and press his palms against the table to steady himself. He looked at Clara, really looked at her for the first time since she had appeared at his fence line, and saw what he should have recognized immediately. The shape of her jaw was his own, the stubborn set of her chin, the way her eyebrows drew together when she was thinking, the particular shade of hazel in her eyes. These were all features he saw every time he looked in a mirror. "You know," Clara said quietly, it was not a question. "You can see it, can't you? Mama always said I had your face, that looking at me was like looking at you all over again. She said it was both a blessing and a curse to be reminded of you every single day. I did not know." The words came out strangled, torn from somewhere deep inside him. "Clara, I swear to you I did not know. If I had known your mother was carrying my child, I never would have left. I would have found a way to make things right no matter what her father said or did." "I know." Clara's voice was gentle, far gentler than any child's voice had a right to be when speaking to a father who had abandoned her before she was born. "Mama explained everything in the letter. She said you left because you overheard something that made you believe she did not love you, that she was only using you for amusement before her proper marriage. But it was not true, Mr. Tanner. None of it was true." Elijah picked up the letter again, his eyes finding the passage that confirmed what Clara was telling him. Elizabeth's words flowed across the page like a confession and an absolution combined, explaining the lies her father had told, the schemes he had constructed to separate them, the heartbreak she had suffered when she woke that morning to find Elijah gone without a word of farewell. "I never married the Henderson boy," she had written. "I refused him the moment I realized you had heard my father's lies and believed them. I was carrying your child, Elijah, though I did not know it yet. By the time I discovered the truth, you had vanished completely, and my father had made certain I would never find you." The fire had burned low in the hearth by the time Elijah finished reading Elizabeth's letter, and the lamp on the table flickered as if struggling to illuminate the truths that had been hidden in darkness for so long. Clara had fallen asleep in her chair, her small body finally surrendering to exhaustion now that she had completed the mission her mother had given her. Her head rested against the chair's wooden back at an angle that would surely leave her neck sore in the morning. But Elijah could not bring himself to wake her just yet. He needed time to absorb what he had learned, to reconcile the story Elizabeth had told with the narrative he had constructed for himself over the past 25 years. He had believed himself betrayed, had nursed that wound through decades of solitude, had used it as a shield against ever allowing himself to love so completely again. And all along, the truth had been something entirely different. Elizabeth had not betrayed him. She had loved him as truly and desperately as he had loved her, and she had paid for that love with a lifetime of sacrifice and sorrow. Her father, furious at her refusal to marry the Henderson boy, had cast her out of the family home with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small amount of money that would not last long. She had been 19 years old, pregnant, and utterly alone in a world that had no mercy for women in her situation. The letter described years of struggle that made Elijah's chest ache with helpless rage. Elizabeth had worked as a seamstress, a laundress, a governess to families who would never have employed her if they had known the truth of her circumstances. She had given birth to Clara in a charity hospital, surrounded by strangers, with no one to hold her hand or tell her that everything would be all right. She had raised their daughter in rented rooms and boarding houses, moving from city to city whenever her past threatened to catch up with her, always one step ahead of poverty and always one step behind respectability. And through it all, she had kept his portrait close to her heart and never stopped loving the man who had disappeared from her life without explanation or farewell. "I do not blame you for leaving," she had written. "My father was clever and cruel, and he knew exactly what lies would drive you away. But I blame myself for not fighting harder, for not finding a way to reach you before it was too late. I should have run after you that night. I should have screamed the truth from the rooftops until you heard me. Instead, I let pride and fear silence me, and we both lost something precious that can never be recovered." Elijah set the letter down and buried his face in his hands. The guilt that washed over him was almost unbearable, a tidal wave of regret for all the years he had wasted, all the moments he had missed, all the suffering he might have prevented, if only he had been brave enough to confront Elizabeth directly, instead of running away like a coward in the night. He had a daughter, a living, breathing child who carried his blood in his features and had traveled across hundreds of miles to find him. And he had not been there for a single moment of her life, not her first steps or her first words, not her birthdays or her illnesses, not the long nights when she must have wondered why other children had fathers and she did not. A soft sound made him look up. Clara had stirred in her sleep, her face tightening as if disturbed by troubled dreams. Without thinking, Elijah rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, lifting her small body as gently as he would have handled a newborn foal. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, a testament to the hardships she had endured, and she did not wake as he carried her to the spare bedroom that had stood empty since Sarah's death. The room smelled of dust and disuse, but the bed was clean and the quilts were warm. He laid Clara down and pulled the covers up to her chin, tucking them around her thin shoulders the way he imagined a father was supposed to do. She murmured something in her sleep, a word that might have been mama, and Elijah felt his heart crack along fault lines he had not known existed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he knew she could not hear him. "I am so sorry for everything you have lost, and everything I was not there to give you." But I am here now, Clara. Whatever that is worth, I am here now. He stood watching her sleep for a long time, this stranger who was somehow his own flesh and blood. The locket lay on the bedside table where he had placed it, its golden surface catching the dim light from the hallway. Tomorrow he would have to think about practical matters, about what Clara's presence in his life would mean, and how he would explain her to the people of Copper Creek. Tonight, all he could do was stand guard over her slumber and wonder at the strange turns fate could take. When he finally returned to the main room, the fire had died to embers, and the coffee in his cup had gone cold. He did not bother to rekindle either one. Instead, he sat in the darkness and let himself remember things he had spent 25 years trying to forget. Elizabeth's laugh, bright and musical, filling the stable where they had stolen their first kiss. Elizabeth's eyes, shining with tears of joy when he had asked her to run away with him. Elizabeth's voice, whispering promises of forever that he had believed with every fiber of his being. She had kept those promises in her own way. She had never married another man, never given her heart to anyone else, never stopped hoping that somehow, someday, she would find him again. And when hope had finally run out, when death had come to claim her at far too young an age, she had spent her last breath sending their daughter to find the father she had never known. It was, Elijah realized, the most profound act of love and trust he had ever witnessed, and it placed upon his shoulders a responsibility he was not sure he was worthy of bearing. Dawn came slowly to the Tanner ranch, creeping across the floorboards with pale fingers of light that found Elijah still sitting in his chair by the cold fireplace. He had not slept, could not have slept even if he had tried, and his body ached with the particular weariness that comes from a night spent wrestling with ghosts. But when he heard movement from the spare bedroom, he rose and began preparing breakfast with hands that moved automatically through tasks they had performed 1,000 times before. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway just as he was setting a plate of eggs and biscuits on the table. She looked better than she had the night before, though dark circles still shadowed her eyes, and her dress hung on her thin frame like a garment made for someone else entirely. She had attempted to tame her tangled hair, pulling it back from her face in a style that reminded Elijah painfully of how Elizabeth had worn hers when she was working. "Good morning," he said, the words feeling inadequate for the magnitude of what lay between them. "I hope you're hungry. I made plenty." Clara nodded and slipped into the chair she had occupied the night before, her eyes taking in the simple meal with an expression of gratitude that spoke volumes about the meals she had missed in recent weeks. She ate more slowly this time, savoring each bite, and Elijah found himself watching her with a fascination he could not quite control. "I have been thinking," he said when she had finished eating and was wiping her mouth with the napkin he had provided, "about what happens now, about what your mother wanted for you when she sent you here." Clara's eyes met his, and once again he was struck by how much older they seemed than her years. "Mama wanted me to have a home," she said simply. "A real home, with someone who would take care of me and teach me things and make sure I did not end up like she did. She said you were a good man, even though you left. She said the leaving was not your fault, and that if you had known about me, you would have come back." The faith Elizabeth had placed in him, even after everything, was almost more than Elijah could bear. He had spent 25 years proving himself unworthy of such faith, hiding from the world on this isolated ranch, allowing his heart to calcify into something that barely resembled the organ it had once been. And now this child was looking at him as if he held the power to make everything right again. "I want to give you that home," he said, the words coming slowly as he felt his way toward a truth he was only beginning to understand. "I want to be the father you never had, if you will let me. But Clara, I need you to understand something. I am not a young man anymore, and I have lived alone for a very long time. I do not know how to be a parent. I do not know if I can be what you need me to be." Clara was quiet for a moment, her small hands folded in her lap in a gesture that seemed far too mature for her age. "Mama did not know how to be a parent either," she said finally. "She told me once that when I was born, she was so scared she could barely hold me. She thought she would break me, or drop me, or do something wrong that would hurt me forever. But she learned. She figured it out as she went along. And even though we did not have much, I always knew she loved me. She looked up at him with those hazel eyes that were so much like his own. I think that is all any child really needs, Mr. Tanner. Someone who loves them enough to try, even when they do not know what they are doing. The simplicity of her wisdom cut through all of Elijah's doubts and fears like a blade through fog. She was not asking him to be perfect. She was not expecting him to transform overnight into something he had never been. She was simply asking him to try, to show up, to love her enough to figure it out as they went along. "You should call me something other than Mr. Tanner," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am not sure I am ready for you to call me father, and I suspect you are not ready for that either. But perhaps we could start with Elijah and see where things go from there." Clara nodded, a small smile touching the corners of her mouth for the first time since he had met her. "Elijah," she repeated, as if testing the feel of the name on her tongue. "I think I can do that." They spent the morning together, and Elijah found himself showing Clara around the ranch with a pride he had not felt in years. He introduced her to the horses, watching her face light up when the gentlest mare nuzzled her palm in search of treats. He showed her the cattle grazing in the south pasture, explained the workings of the well and the windmill, pointed out the boundaries of the property that stretched farther than her eyes could see. Through it all, Clara asked questions, hundreds of questions, about how things worked and why he did them this way instead of that way, and what happened when winter came and the snow made everything difficult. Her curiosity was boundless, and Elijah found himself enjoying the experience of sharing his knowledge with someone who genuinely wanted to learn. By midday, he had made a decision that surprised even himself. "We need to go into town," he announced as they finished a lunch of cold ham and bread. "You need proper clothes and supplies, and there are people I should introduce you to, people who will want to know why Elijah Tanner suddenly has a child living with him." The thought of explaining Clara's presence to the gossips of Copper Creek filled him with dread, but he knew it could not be avoided. Better to control the narrative himself than to let rumors and speculation run wild through a community that thrived on both. Clara deserved better than to be whispered about behind hands and scrutinized by suspicious eyes. "Will they be kind to me?" Clara asked, and the vulnerability in her voice reminded him that beneath her remarkable composure, she was still just a little girl who had lost everything she knew. "They will be," Elijah promised, "or they will answer to me." The road to Copper Creek wound through grassland that shimmered golden in the autumn sunlight, and Clara sat beside Elijah on the wagon bench with her eyes wide open, drinking in every detail of the landscape as if she had never seen open country before. Perhaps she had not, Elijah realized. Elizabeth's letter had mentioned cities and towns, boarding houses and cramped apartments, but never the vast empty spaces that defined life in Wyoming territory. "It goes on forever," Clara breathed, turning her head to follow the flight of a hawk circling overhead. "I did not know the world could be so big and so empty at the same time." "It is not empty," Elijah said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his own voice. "It is full of life if you know where to look. Deer in the draws, rabbits in the brush, fish in the streams, eagles and hawks and songbirds, even wolves, though they keep their distance from the ranch most of the time." Clara shivered at the mention of wolves, and Elijah made a mental note to reassure her later about the precautions he took to keep the livestock in the house safe. There would be time for such lessons, he reminded himself. Time for everything, now that she was here. Copper Creek appeared on the horizon as a cluster of buildings huddled together against the immensity of the prairie, as if seeking comfort in proximity. It was not a large town by any standard, perhaps 300 souls on a busy day, but it had everything a community needed to survive: a general store, a blacksmith, a church, a schoolhouse, and the assorted businesses that sprang up wherever people gathered to make their lives. Elijah felt Clara tense beside him as they approached the main street, and he understood her anxiety better than she might have expected. He had felt the same way himself once, when he first arrived in this territory as a young man with nothing but grief and determination to sustain him. Small towns could be welcoming or cruel, depending on factors that often had little to do with the newcomer and everything to do with the mood of those already established. "Stay close to me," he said quietly as he guided the wagon to a stop in front of Harrison's general store. "Let me do most of the talking, at least at first. People here know me, and they will be curious about you, but they will not be unkind if I make it clear that you are under my protection." Clara nodded, her small hand finding his arm and gripping it with the same surprising strength she had shown the day before. Together, they climbed down from the wagon and walked into the store, where Martha Harrison stood behind the counter, sorting through a new shipment of fabric. Martha was a woman of perhaps 60 years, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing that happened in her establishment or anywhere else in Copper Creek. She had been one of the first settlers in the area, arriving with her husband nearly 40 years ago, and she considered herself the unofficial guardian of the town's moral standards. Her opinion could make or break a reputation, and Elijah knew that how she received Clara would set the tone for everyone else. "Elijah Tanner," Martha said, looking up from her work with an expression of mild surprise. "Twice in 1 month. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Mrs. Harrison," Elijah replied, removing his hat in a gesture of respect he rarely bothered with. "I have someone I would like you to meet. This is Clara Bennett. She will be living with me from now on." Martha's eyes shifted to Clara, taking in the child's worn dress, her thin frame, her obvious nervousness. For a long moment she said nothing, and Elijah could practically see the calculations happening behind her sharp gaze. A man his age, unmarried for over 20 years, suddenly appearing with a young girl he claimed would be living with him. The potential for scandal was enormous. "Living with you," Martha repeated carefully. "And what exactly is your relationship to this child, Elijah?" He had known this question would come, had spent the entire ride into town deciding how to answer it. The truth was complicated and potentially damaging to Clara's reputation, but lies had a way of unraveling in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. In the end, he chose honesty, because it was the only currency he had ever trusted. "She is my daughter," he said, and the words felt strange and right and terrifying all at once. "Her mother passed away recently, and Clara has come to live with me. I did not know of her existence until yesterday, Mrs. Harrison, but I intend to do right by her now." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it could not have been more than a few seconds. Martha's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, calculation, something that might have been sympathy, before settling into a look of pragmatic acceptance that Elijah had not dared to hope for. "Well," she said finally, coming around the counter to look at Clara more closely, "I suppose that explains the resemblance. She has your eyes, Elijah, and your stubborn chin. What happened to her mother?" "Consumption," Clara answered before Elijah could speak, her voice small but steady. "She was sick for a long time, but she never stopped working until she could not get out of bed anymore. She was very brave." Something in Martha's face softened at the child's words, a crack in the formidable armor she wore against the world. "I am sure she was, child. It takes a brave woman to raise a daughter alone, and it takes an even braver one to send that daughter across the territory to find a father she has never met." She straightened and looked at Elijah with an expression he could not quite read. "You will need supplies, clothes for the girl certainly, and probably some things to make that bachelor cabin of yours more suitable for a child. I will help you put together what you need, and I will make sure the town knows that Clara Tanner is to be treated with the same respect as any other child in Copper Creek." Clara Tanner. The name hung in the air between them, a gift and a declaration, and a promise all wrapped into 2 simple words. Elijah felt something loosen in his chest that he had not even known was tight. The news of Clara Tanner's arrival spread through Copper Creek like wildfire through dry grass, and by the time Elijah and Clara emerged from the general store with their purchases, a small crowd had gathered on the wooden sidewalk outside. Some faces were curious, others skeptical, and a few held the particular expression of righteous disapproval that Elijah had learned to recognize over his years in the territory. Small towns had long memories and strict standards, and a man who suddenly produced a grown daughter he had never mentioned was bound to attract attention of every kind. "Elijah Tanner," called a voice from the crowd, and Elijah turned to see Reverend Samuel Whitfield pushing his way forward. The minister was a thin, severe man in his 60s who had presided over Copper Creek's spiritual life for nearly 2 decades. He had buried Sarah when she died, had spoken words of comfort that Elijah had barely heard through the fog of his grief, and had spent the years since occasionally trying to draw Elijah back into the fold of regular church attendance. "Reverend," Elijah acknowledged, positioning himself slightly in front of Clara in an instinctive gesture of protection. "I expect you have heard the news." "I have heard rumors," Reverend Whitfield replied, his eyes moving to Clara with an assessing gaze that made Elijah's jaw tighten. "Rumors of a child appearing from nowhere, claiming to be your daughter. Rumors of a mother who has conveniently passed away and cannot confirm or deny the story. You must understand, Elijah, that such claims require verification before the community can simply accept them." Clara's hand found the back of Elijah's coat and gripped it tightly, and he could feel her trembling against him. She had already endured so much, traveled so far, and now she was being subjected to public interrogation by a man who should have been offering comfort instead of suspicion. "The child has proof," Elijah said, keeping his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "A locket containing my portrait, painted 25 years ago in St. Louis. A letter from her mother explaining everything, and the evidence of her own face, Reverend, which anyone with eyes can see bears my features as clearly as if I had stamped them there myself." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Elijah saw several heads nodding as people looked more closely at Clara and recognized the resemblance he had described. But Reverend Whitfield was not so easily satisfied. "A portrait proves nothing except that her mother possessed your likeness," he said, "and letters can say anything their authors wish them to say. What I am asking, Elijah, is whether you can swear before God and this community that this child is truly your blood, conceived in a relationship that you have never once mentioned in all your years among us." The challenge hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Reverend Whitfield was not merely questioning Clara's parentage. He was questioning Elijah's honesty, his character, the very foundations of the reputation he had built over 3 decades in Copper Creek. "I can swear it," Elijah said, and his voice carried across the gathered crowd with a force that surprised even himself. "I can swear that 25 years ago, I loved a woman named Elizabeth Whitmore with everything I had. I can swear that I believed she had betrayed me, and that I left her without knowing she carried my child. I can swear that I have spent every day since then regretting that decision, though I did not know until yesterday just how much I had lost because of it." He looked down at Clara, at this small miracle who had walked into his life and shattered the careful walls he had built around his heart. "And I can swear that this child is mine, Reverend, mine by blood, and mine by right, and mine by the last wishes of a woman who loved me enough to send her daughter across the territory to find me when she knew she was dying." The crowd had gone silent, transfixed by the raw emotion in Elijah's voice. Even Reverend Whitfield seemed taken aback by the depth of feeling his challenge had unleashed. For a long moment, no one spoke, and the only sound was the wind whistling between the buildings and the distant lowing of cattle from the stockyards at the edge of town. Then a new voice broke the silence, a woman's voice, strong and clear and carrying the unmistakable tone of authority. "That is enough, Samuel. The man has made his declaration, and I, for one, believe him." The crowd parted to reveal Margaret Whitfield, the Reverend's own wife, standing with her arms crossed and her expression fierce. She was a formidable woman, nearly as tall as her husband and considerably broader, with a reputation for speaking her mind regardless of the consequences. "Margaret," Reverend Whitfield began, but his wife cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I have known Elijah Tanner for 20 years, she said, addressing the crowd rather than her husband. "I have never once known him to lie, not even when a lie might have served him better than the truth. If he says this child is his daughter, then she is his daughter, and I will not stand here and watch her be humiliated on her first day in town." She stepped forward and bent down to look Clara directly in the eyes. "Welcome to Copper Creek, child. I teach the Sunday school class for children your age, and I expect to see you there this weekend. We will be studying the story of Ruth, who also traveled a great distance to find a new family among strangers." Clara's grip on Elijah's coat loosened slightly. and he saw something like hope flicker in her eyes. "Thank you, ma'am," she said softly. "I would like that very much." Margaret straightened and fixed her husband with a look that promised a private conversation later. "Now then, I believe we have all gawked enough for one day. Let these two get on with their business, and let the rest of us remember that charity and welcome are supposed to be Christian virtues." The crowd began to disperse, some shamefaced, others merely disappointed that the spectacle had ended. Reverend Whitfield lingered a moment longer, his expression troubled, before his wife took his arm and guided him firmly away. The ride home from Copper Creek was quieter than the journey into town had been, but it was a different kind of quiet. Clara sat close to Elijah on the wagon bench, closer than she had that morning, and there was something in her posture that suggested the beginning of trust rather than mere exhaustion. The confrontation with Reverend Whitfield had been difficult, but it had also been clarifying. Elijah had declared Clara as his daughter before the entire town, and in doing so, he had committed himself to a path from which there could be no turning back. "Will they all accept me eventually?" Clara asked as the ranch came into view on the horizon. "The people in town, I mean, will they stop looking at me like I am something strange and suspicious?" Elijah considered the question carefully before answering. He had learned long ago that children deserved honesty, even when that honesty was complicated. "Most of them will," he said. "Mrs. Whitfield's support carries a great deal of weight in Copper Creek, and Martha Harrison at the general store has already decided to champion your cause. Those two women together can shift the opinion of nearly anyone in town. But there will always be some who hold on to their doubts, Clara. Some people find it easier to believe the worst about others than to accept that the world is more complicated than they imagined." Clara nodded slowly, processing his words with the seriousness that seemed to characterize everything she did. "Mama used to say something similar. She said that people would judge her for having me without a husband, no matter how hard she worked or how well she raised me. She said the only thing she could do was live her life with dignity and let her actions speak louder than their whispers." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," Elijah said, and he meant it. The Elizabeth he had known 25 years ago had been young and sheltered, raised in luxury, and protected from the harsh realities of the world. The woman who had raised Clara alone, who had worked and sacrificed and maintained her dignity through years of hardship, was someone he wished desperately he could have known. She was, Clara agreed. She was also sad sometimes when she thought I could not see. She would hold your portrait and look at it for hours, and I could tell she was remembering something that hurt her deeply. I did not understand until she told me the truth right before she died. Then everything made sense. They pulled into the yard as the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the land that was now Clara's home as much as it was Elijah's. He helped her down from the wagon and began unloading the supplies they had purchased, his mind still turning over the things she had told him about Elizabeth's final years. "Clara," he said as they carried packages into the house, "I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it up for the years I was not there. I cannot change the past, but I can promise you that from this day forward, you will never be alone again. You will never wonder where your next meal is coming from, or whether you have a roof over your head, or whether anyone in this world cares what happens to you." Clara set down the bundle she was carrying and looked at him with those ancient eyes that held so much of Elizabeth and so much of himself. "Mama said you would say something like that. She said your honor would not let you do anything less than your best by me, once you knew I existed. But Elijah," she paused, seeming to gather her courage for what she wanted to say next, "I do not need you to make up for anything. I just need you to be here, to teach me things and talk to me and let me be part of your life. That is all Mama ever wanted for me, and it is all I want for myself." The simplicity of her request undid something in Elijah that he had not known was still wound tight. He had been thinking in terms of obligation and duty, of debts owed and payments required. But Clara was not asking for compensation. She was asking for connection, for the simple human need to belong somewhere and to someone. "I can do that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I can absolutely do that." That evening they sat together by the fire, while Elijah showed Clara how to mend a bridle, his large hands guiding her smaller ones through the process of threading leather and tying knots. It was a simple skill, practical and unglamorous, but Clara approached it with the same intense focus she brought to everything, and by the time the fire had burned low, she had completed her first repair with only minimal assistance. "You learn quickly," Elijah observed, examining her work with genuine approval. "That is a useful trait out here, where there is always something that needs fixing or building or tending." Clara beamed at the praise, and for a moment she looked like any other child her age, pleased by a parent's approval and eager for more. The expression transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of grief and worry that usually clouded her features. "Mama taught me to pay attention," she said. "She said that watching carefully and asking questions were the most important skills anyone could have. She learned that the hard way, she told me, when she had to figure out how to survive on her own without anyone to help her." "Your mother was remarkable," Elijah said, and the words felt inadequate to describe a woman who had endured so much with such grace. "I wish I had known what she became after I left. I wish I had been there to help her, to share the burden of raising you, to give her the life she deserved instead of the one she was forced to build alone." "She knew you would have come if you had known," Clara said softly. "That was why she never blamed you, Elijah. She always said the fault was her father's for telling those lies and driving you away. And she said she forgave him eventually, because holding on to anger was too heavy a burden to carry alongside everything else." The weeks that followed Clara's arrival brought changes to the Tanner Ranch that Elijah could never have anticipated. The house that had stood silent and solitary for so many years now echoed with the sounds of a child's footsteps, her questions, her laughter when something delighted her, and occasionally her tears when grief for her mother overwhelmed her without warning. Elijah learned to navigate these moments as best he could, offering awkward comfort that gradually became less awkward, sitting with Clara through her sorrow without trying to fix what could not be fixed. She started attending the schoolhouse in town, walking the 3 miles each morning with a determination that reminded Elijah of her mother's spirit. The teacher, a young woman named Miss Abernathy who had arrived in Copper Creek just 2 years prior, sent regular reports of Clara's progress that filled Elijah with unexpected pride. His daughter was clever, Miss Abernathy wrote, quick with numbers and even quicker with words, though she sometimes struggled to connect with children who had known each other since birth. The other children were curious about Clara, drawn to the mystery of her sudden appearance and the romantic tragedy of her story. Some approached with genuine friendliness, eager to include her in their games and secrets. Others were less kind, parroting the suspicions and prejudices they had absorbed from parents who still whispered about Elijah Tanner's convenient daughter. Clara bore both responses with a quiet dignity that made Elijah's heart ache, knowing she had learned such composure far too young. It was on a cold November evening, nearly 2 months after Clara's arrival, that the past reached out once more to complicate their fragile new beginning. Elijah had just finished the evening chores and was walking back to the house when he saw a rider approaching from the direction of town. The horse was fine, better than anything owned by the locals, and the rider sat with the particular posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Clara had seen him too, and she stood in the doorway of the ranch house with her face pale and her hands gripping the door frame. The fear in her eyes told Elijah everything he needed to know before the rider even came close enough to identify. "You know who that is," Elijah said, not a question. "Grandfather," Clara whispered. "Mama's father. He found us once before when I was 6. Mama packed everything we owned that same night and we left the city. She said he wanted to take me away from her, to raise me properly as a Whitmore should be raised. She said she would die before she let him have me." The rider drew closer, and Elijah could see now that he was an old man, perhaps 70 or more, with white hair beneath an expensive hat and a face that bore the particular hardness of someone who had spent his life accumulating power and using it without mercy. This was the man who had lied to Elijah 25 years ago, who had cast his own daughter out for refusing to abandon the man she loved, who had spent decades hunting Elizabeth and Clara across the country. "Go inside," Elijah told Clara, his voice calm despite the anger building in his chest. Lock the door and do not come out until I tell you it is safe." "But Elijah—" "Now, Clara, please." She hesitated for just a moment, then retreated into the house. He heard the lock click into place behind her and felt a small measure of relief. Whatever was about to happen, at least she would not be caught in the middle of it. The rider stopped his horse a few yards from where Elijah stood and looked down at him with an expression of contempt that seemed to come as naturally as breathing. "You must be Tanner," the old man said, "the horse trainer who ruined my daughter's life." "And you must be Whitmore," Elijah replied evenly, "the father who threw his pregnant daughter into the street and spent 25 years hunting her like an animal." Something flickered in Whitmore's eyes, surprise perhaps that Elijah knew the truth, or perhaps just the reflexive anger of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. "Elizabeth is dead," Whitmore said, and there was no grief in his voice, only a cold statement of fact. "I received word from the hospital where she died. They found letters among her belongings, letters that mention this place and your name. I have come for my granddaughter." "Clara is not yours to take," Elijah said, and he was surprised by how steady his voice remained despite the fury coursing through him. "She is my daughter, living in my home, under my protection. You have no claim on her." Whitmore's laugh was harsh and humorless. "No claim. I am her grandfather. I can provide her with education, society, opportunities that a backwater rancher could never dream of offering. Any court in the land would recognize my superior ability to provide for the child's welfare. Any court would also hear how you treated her mother, how you lied to separate Elizabeth from the man she loved, how you threw her out when she refused to abandon her child, how you chased her from city to city, forcing her to live in poverty and fear until the strain of running finally destroyed her health." Elijah took a step closer to the horse, looking up at the old man with eyes that held no fear and no compromise. "Elizabeth kept records, Whitmore, letters, documents, evidence of everything you did. She knew you might come for Clara someday, and she wanted to make sure I had the weapons to fight you. So go ahead and take this to court. Let the whole world hear what kind of man you really are." Whitmore's face had gone pale, and Elijah could see the calculations happening behind his cold eyes. The old man had expected to find a simple rancher, easily intimidated by wealth and social standing. He had not expected to find a father prepared to burn everything down to protect his child. "This is not over," Whitmore said finally, jerking his horse's reins to turn the animal around. "I have resources you cannot imagine. I will have that child, one way or another." "If you come near her again," Elijah said quietly, "I will make sure you regret it for whatever time you have left on this earth. That is not a threat, Whitmore. It is a promise." The winter that followed Whitmore's visit was the harshest Copper Creek had seen in a decade, with snow piling high against the ranch house walls and temperatures dropping so low that even the hardiest cattle required constant attention. But inside the Tanner home, a different kind of warmth had taken root, the warmth of two people learning to be a family despite the odds stacked against them and the threat that still loomed on the horizon. Whitmore had not returned in person, but his presence made itself felt in other ways. Letters arrived from lawyers in distant cities, demanding custody hearings and questioning Elijah's fitness as a parent. Investigators appeared in Copper Creek, asking questions about Elijah's past, his finances, his reputation. The old man was building a case, marshaling his considerable resources for a legal battle that could drag on for years and cost more money than Elijah could hope to earn in a lifetime. But Copper Creek had rallied around its own in ways that surprised even those who had lived there longest. Martha Harrison organized a collection to help with legal expenses, and the jar on her counter filled with coins and bills from families who had little to spare but gave anyway. Margaret Whitfield wrote letters to everyone she knew in positions of influence, testifying to Elijah's character and Clara's obvious happiness in her new home. Even Reverend Whitfield, chastened by his initial suspicion, preached a sermon on the sacred bonds between parent and child that left few dry eyes in the congregation. The legal battle came to a head in early spring, when a circuit judge arrived in Copper Creek to hear the custody case that had attracted attention far beyond the territory's borders. The courtroom was packed with townspeople who had come to support Elijah and Clara, their presence a silent testament to the community that had formed around this unlikely family. Whitmore sat at the front of the room with his team of expensive lawyers, his face a mask of confident superiority. He had spared no expense in preparing his case, presenting evidence of his wealth, his social standing, his ability to provide Clara with every material advantage a child could want. His lawyers painted Elijah as an aging rancher of limited means, a man who had abandoned Elizabeth without knowing of her pregnancy, and who had only accepted Clara out of guilt rather than genuine affection. But when Clara herself took the stand, everything changed. She spoke clearly and without hesitation, describing the life she had lived with her mother, the love Elizabeth had carried for Elijah through all those years of hardship, the final weeks when her mother had pressed the locket into her hands and made her promise to find the father she had never known. "My mother could have told me anything about my father," Clara said, her hazel eyes meeting Whitmore's across the courtroom. "She could have said he was dead, or that he did not want me, or that he was a bad man who should be forgotten. But she did not. She told me he was good and honorable, that he had been tricked into leaving, and that if he had known about me, he would have moved heaven and earth to be part of my life." She turned to look at Elijah, and the love in her eyes made his chest ache with emotions he had thought himself no longer capable of feeling. "She was right," Clara continued. "From the moment I arrived at his ranch, Elijah has been everything my mother promised he would be. He has fed me and clothed me and taught me and sat with me when I cried for my mama. He declared me as his daughter before the whole town, even though it would have been easier to turn me away. He is my father, and I want to stay with him. Please do not take me away from the only family I have left." The judge deliberated for less than an hour before rendering his verdict. Clara would remain with Elijah, her legal father, and Whitmore would be prohibited from contacting her without Elijah's explicit permission. The old man's face contorted with fury as the decision was announced, but there was nothing he could do. His money and his influence had finally met a force they could not overcome, the simple truth of a child's love for the parent who had chosen her. That evening, Elijah and Clara sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set over the mountains in brilliant shades of orange and gold. The snow had begun to melt, and everywhere the land showed signs of spring's approach. Green shoots pushing through the brown grass, birds returning from their winter migration, the promise of new life emerging from the long, cold months. "It is over," Clara said, leaning against Elijah's shoulder with a contentment that she had never known before. "We are really a family now, are we not?" Elijah put his arm around her, marveling at how natural the gesture had become over these past months. "We were always a family," he said. "The judge just made it official." Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the locket that had brought them together, the golden case worn smooth from decades of handling, first by her mother and now by her. She opened it to reveal the portrait inside, the young man Elijah had been before loss and solitude had carved their marks into his face. "Mama would be happy," she said softly. She always believed this day would come, even when everything seemed impossible. She used to say that love was stronger than distance, stronger than time, stronger than all the lies and schemes that tried to keep people apart. Elijah looked at the portrait, at the hopeful young man he had been before Elizabeth, before Sarah, before the walls he had built around his heart. That man had believed in love too, once, before life had taught him to believe in nothing but his own self-sufficiency. But Clara had taught him something different. She had taught him that walls could be torn down, that hearts could heal, that it was never too late to become the person you were meant to be. Her mother had sent her across the territory on nothing but faith and a golden locket, and that faith had been rewarded beyond anything either of them could have imagined. "Your mother was right," Elijah said, pressing a kiss to the top of Clara's head. "Love is stronger than everything, and I will spend the rest of my days proving that to you." The locket gleamed in the fading light, its portrait a bridge between past and present, between loss and redemption, between a man who had given up on love and the daughter who had taught him to believe again. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, vast and challenging and full of possibilities, just as it had always been. But now, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elijah Tanner was not facing it alone.